Welcome, all of you. This is a special webinar session on the preemptive nuclear attacks on the Korean Peninsula. By whom, we do not know, okay? Anyhow, but that is very, very important topic, particularly since Bob Woodward published the book, The Rage. In that book, Bob Woodward mentioned while he was having an interview with then Secretary of Defense James Mattis, that he was quoting James Mattis that the U.S. The Strategic Command was reviewed and studied the Operational Plan 5027, a response to an attack that could include the use of 80 nuclear weapons. But that sentence really scared a lot of South Koreans. And there's an ongoing debate in South Korea. Who is going to use 80 nuclear weapons? Some newspapers argue that there is a North Korean use of 80 nuclear weapons. Some others argue there is American use of 80 nuclear weapons. But whoever uses 80 nuclear weapons, there could be a catastrophic end of the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, that really scared a lot of folks in South Korea. That is why we decided to organize this special webinar to, in a sense, to inform and educate the people, not only in South Korea, but also all around the world. That is why the APLN, which stands for the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and the East Asia Foundation have decided to organize this special webinar. And we have a really, lucky to have such a renowned specialist. We have Dr. Morton Halperin, who worked at the Johnson White House, and then it's the Nixon State Department, right? And then he was also appointed as an Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia Pacific. But he was a scholar. He was a professor at Harvard University, but he came to Washington and became the renowned specialist. Right now, he's serving as a senior advisor to the Open Society Foundation. Mort, thank you very much for joining us. And we have another...
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Another distinguished guest today, Dr. Siegfried Hecker. Dr. Hecker is so well known in Korea. He's the only person who's been to Yongbyon nuclear facilities 4 times, okay? Out of his, I think, 8 or 9 times visit to North Korea. And he was a director of Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Okay? I understand that institute designed nuclear weapons. I don't know whether I'm right or not, but you can correct me. But Dr. Hecker served as a director of Los Alamos Laboratory for 12 years. And afterwards, he was a professor emeritus at the Stanford University. And now I believe that because of coronavirus, now he's staying in New Mexico. And also we have Peter Hayes from Australia. You all know Peter Hayes. Peter Hayes is also very famous in South Korea. Because of his book in 1990s, he wrote a book called The Pacific Powder Keg. And in that book, he disclosed that the US maintained 950 tactical nuclear warheads in Kunsan. And that stirred enormous outrage in South Korea. Up until that time, the South Koreans did not know that the US was maintaining tactical nuclear weapons, But anyhow, Peter co-founded the Nautilus Institute, and he's a resource economist from University of California, Berkeley, but he has been touching on the wide variety of issues. But recently, he's focusing on pandemic, public health response, and regional cooperation, whatever. But his bottom line is he's a energy specialist, nuclear specialist, and he has been doing a lot of works in North Korea. He's the first outsider who built wind power in a plant in nearby Pyongyang. Therefore, he's very, the keen observer of Korean affairs. And the last but not the least, okay, but I'm following the alphabetical order, okay? We have Professor Eun Lim. She got her PhD from SAIS, Johns Hopkins, and he taught at the SAIS for a while, and then he moved to Ritsumeikan University in Japan, and then she came to Korea. Now she's a professor at the Gongju National University. She has been doing a lot of energy works, particularly energy in Northeast Asia, but over the several years, past years, she has been dealing with, North Korean nuclear issues and etc. Therefore, she's a right person to discuss the topic. No, now, as I pointed out, we'll be touching several issues, such, is it really possible the use of 80 nuclear weapons over the Korean Peninsula or over the US mainland, okay? And does North Korea have such a capability, okay? Doesn't the United States have such an intention and more gut to use 80 nuclear weapons? And another big issue is this, what is the so-called American, nuclear doctrine on preemptive nuclear attack, okay? It's morally absurd, okay? But still, a lot of people talking about it. Even, Secretary James Mattis mentioned that one in the Bob Woodward's book. Therefore, we are really concerned about whole this idea of preemptive and nuclear attack. And if you go back to September 2017, President Donald Trump was mentioning that the total destruction of North Korea, unless he uses nuclear weapons, it is totally impossible, inconceivable to totally destroy North Korea. Therefore, we Koreans are very much concerned about this American thinking on the possible use of these nuclear weapons. Then the whole issue is how to prevent it, okay? What are the ways to prevent the kind of nuclear disaster, catastrophic disaster in Korea or even in the US, okay? And finally, I hope that you can touch the issue of a North Korean nuclear issue. Now, it has been stalemate, okay? And a lot of people argue that there is no progress in North Korean nuclear issue, partly because of pandemic, and also partly because of American presidential election. And North Korea would not move until the November 3rd presidential election is over. Then what would be the development of North Korean nuclear issue after the presidential election, okay? And what is the impact of US presidential election on the resolution of North Korean nuclear issues? Those are the kinds of issues which I hope we can discuss this 1 hour and 30-minute session. Now, I'll moderate in such a way. I'll give you 5 to 10 minutes to each of you, starting with Maud, Sig, Peter, and Eun, okay? And then afterwards, and I'll be asking several questions to all of you. Then I will set aside about the 30 minutes for comments and questions from the floor. And all those who are watching this webinar, please send your questions and comments through chatting in a function, and I'll be able to see over my laptop, and I'll pass your questions and comments to today's presenters. Okay, now Maud, let us start.
Okay. Well, let me start by going quickly through the history of American government attitudes towards the use of nuclear weapons as they affect the Korean Peninsula. Because I think a lot of the things that we hear about that are scary are the residue, the vestiges of the policy that was adopted in the Eisenhower administration. You remember during the Truman administration, President Truman suggested once that perhaps he would use nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And there was a very strong outrage in the Congress of the United States, in the American public, and in England. And so the Prime Minister of England had to promise to fly to the United States, get a commitment from Truman that he would not use nuclear weapons during the Korean War. And I think that was an honest commitment. I think, in fact, the statement that Truman made that was suggesting that he might use nuclear weapons was a misunderstanding of what he was intending to say. Truman, in fact, I think, of all of our presidents, had the most profound understanding, of course, of the consequences of using nuclear weapons and was determined not to use them again. Eisenhower had a very different view. His view was that we had to use nuclear weapons, that we were outmanned by the Russians and the Chinese, and that the only way the United States could meet its security commitments was to threaten and plan to use nuclear weapons. So that nuclear weapons were put everywhere in the world where it was possible to do so. Unless the government of the host country strenuously and seriously objected, we put nuclear weapons everywhere that we could. And that included, of course, the Korean Peninsula. We then had war plans which assumed that nuclear weapons would be used in any conflict, and the military were not equipped for any serious extended conventional conflict operations. And I saw that in a study I did of the Quemoy-Matsu crisis of 1958, in which the US government was operating on the assumption that if there was a war, the only way we could defend against the Chinese invasion was by the use of nuclear weapons. The Kennedy administration totally changed that. It moved from a posture in which nuclear weapons would be used if a war went on more than a few days, to a posture in which it would try not to use nuclear weapons and would only use nuclear weapons if it was necessary to prevent defeat, without anybody having a clear notion then of how you would actually use the nuclear weapons. There was change in the immediate equipment of forces, so that all American forces are equipped now so that they can engage in sustained conventional combat. And that was true on the Korean Peninsula as well as every place else. But there was a not change in the deployment. And so you continued to have a substantial number of nuclear weapons in a number of different places, including on the Korean Peninsula, simply because nobody had removed them. I actually tried with a colleague named Ivan Selin when we were in the Johnson Defense Department to do a study of whether we could remove all our nuclear weapons from all of Asia. And we were about to conclude that we could and asked the Secretary of Defense to withdraw them when the Joint Chiefs threatened to go to the President if we did that. And so Paul Nitze, who was the Deputy Secretary, said Johnson would not be in the mood for a fight with the chiefs and we could not do it. But there was no need for the nuclear weapons that remained on the Korean Peninsula. They were there simply because they had previously been there, and the Johnson administration civilians were not willing to have a fight with the military to take them out. And it was only, of course, in the Bush administration which much Republican administrations are much less concerned about the attitude of the Joint Chiefs, and then the weapons were taken out. Since then, I think there's come to be a clear understanding that there is no utility for the use of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, or indeed any place else, as a matter of first use or even of second use. And the United States government, it is my understanding, has informed the Korean government that in response to a North Korean use of nuclear weapons, it would not necessarily respond with nuclear weapons. And I believe that it would not respond with nuclear weapons, that it would use its overwhelming, sustained conventional capability to end the war as quickly as possible with as few nuclear weapons used as possible. No number of nuclear weapons used on the Korean Peninsula will permit the peninsula to survive in anything like its current status. And we need to do everything we can to reduce that possibility, including by making it clear that we will not initiate the use of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Mort. Okay, now, Dr. Hacker, it's your turn.
Thank you, Chung-Yin. And thank you, Morton, for such a concise coverage of history. I thought it was a good way to start the session. So with that in mind, of you having covered sort of the US view as it's changed along the years, let me then try to tackle, as Professor Moon indicated, you know, that at one point, with the mention in the book, there's actually the question that it could have been a reference to 80 North Korean nuclear weapons. And, you know, my immediate response to that was, well, that's nonsense. You know, that first of all, I mean, they don't have, as far as we know, and as far as I estimate, they don't have 80 nuclear weapons. Not even thinking about how in the world you'd actually shoot off 80 nuclear weapons. So let me sort of, for the sense of giving you some indication of how I estimate the North Korean nuclear capabilities. As Professor Moon pointed out, I've had occasion to be at Yongbyon. Actually, they had me there 4 times. And I was in Pyongyang also another 3 times. So 7 visits altogether. In all cases, even when I didn't visit Yongbyon, we had discussions about nuclear matters. The visits, to put them in the time perspective, the first one was in January of 2004, and the last one was in November of 2010. And they occurred every year for 7 years. Based on that visit, based on seeing the facilities, and based on my discussions with the North Korean technical people, particularly, but also the political people, I've been sort of then keeping up an estimate for how North Korea has grown its nuclear capabilities. And, you know, just since I'm a professor at Stanford these days, you know, I have to do a little bit of the educational mode and to say, you know, what you need for nuclear weapons is, first of all, you need the nuclear materials, the bomb fuel. And that is either plutonium or highly enriched uranium. Those are the 2 paths to the bomb. By the way, plutonium was Nagasaki and highly enriched uranium was Hiroshima, just for your indication. They both had massive destruction, you know, 15 to 20 or so kilotons. And in each case, 1 city was destroyed with 1 bomb. And then the second thing you need is you need to be able to design a bomb and build a bomb. What we call weaponization. And the third thing you need to be able to deliver that bomb. And of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were B-29s. In the case of North Korea, they've put their emphasis on missiles right from the beginning, and that still seems to be the case. So North Korea has not been able to amass a lot of the bomb fuel, and particularly the best bomb fuel, which it turns out to be plutonium by quite a lot. They've made very limited amounts of plutonium over the years. My current estimate is that they have somewhere between 25 and 50 kilograms of plutonium. It takes about 5 or 6 to make a bomb. That gives you some idea. But then the second path, this highly enriched uranium, you know, which it was interesting, the North Koreans denied year after year, starting in the second year of the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration in 2002, they denied it every year. And then in 2010, lo and behold, my last visit, they showed me this modern centrifuge facility with which you can make highly enriched uranium. And so from that point on, we knew they could make highly enriched uranium, but it's very uncertain for us to know exactly how much. We think somewhere on the order of 500 to 750, 800 kilograms. Today, maybe by today, 900 kilograms. And it takes about 25 or so kilograms of highly enriched uranium to make a bomb. So to make a long story short, that means the North Koreans may have enough of the bomb fuel for roughly 40, 45 nuclear devices. They can't get to 80. There's nothing from what I've learned, from what I know from keeping track, that would get them to 80. US intel agencies have said sort of 20 to 60. And that's a wide range, but it's somewhere. They have enough materials for, let's say, 40 or so nuclear weapons. Then the next question, of course, is what kind of nuclear weapons? You know, the atomic bombs, as we call them, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on the order of 15 to 20 kilotons. Those are just simple, what we call fission or atomic bombs. You've all heard about hydrogen bombs. You know, that's when you actually use a two-stage device, and you not only use the bomb fuel uranium or highly enriched uranium or plutonium, but you actually use hydrogen fuels, isotopes of tritium. The difference is that the hydrogen bombs can be very large yields, and indeed, we don't know exactly how the North Koreans have designed their nuclear weapons. They've shown us some models of those weapons, but of course we don't know whether those are real weapons. But the bottom line is they've tested and have done 6 nuclear tests. First one didn't work so well. The other 5 worked just fine. And the last one, September 3rd of 2017, looks to have been a hydrogen bomb. So, you know, maybe 250 kilotons, more than 10 times the explosive yield of Nagasaki. So now we have to say, okay, the North Koreans know how to build those kind of bombs, at least ones that they can put inside a mountain and blow up. The next question then becomes, now can they take those bombs, which they can put in a big cavity in a weapon, and actually make them small enough to put on a missile? And that's a difficult situation. First of all, you have to have the missiles. And again, just a quick summary, you know, North Koreans initially, you know, sort of getting help from, mostly from the Soviet Union, but also a little bit from the Chinese. And then their own developments, they know how to make short and medium range nuclear missiles that can reach all of South Korea and most of Japan. And my view is, on the basis of everything I've seen in my discussions, is I believe they can make a nuclear warhead that can fit on those missiles. So in other words, the North Koreans today would have the capability, at least we have to assume they have the capability to deliver a nuclear warhead anywhere in South Korea and most of Japan. Now these would be the simpler type and on the shorter and medium range missiles. The North Koreans have also now demonstrated, particularly in 2017, that they can make missiles that are long range, that potentially could reach the United States. But in my opinion, they have not yet done enough tests, and not enough tests with the proper flight path to actually have a militarily useful ICBM. And I also believe they cannot put a warhead that's small enough on one of those ICBMs and have it survive that trip and impact the United States. So even though, you know, our military planners, they sort of have to plan for the worst case, I like to look at the most likely case. And as I indicated, I do not think that they can reach the United States. And so from my standpoint, then, as I look at those capabilities, so North Korea would have the capability to launch some number of missiles with nuclear warheads into South Korea and into Japan. And that's very serious business by itself. You know, could they do 80? No, they don't have 80. Do they need 80? No, they don't need 80. You know, one will destroy a huge part of Seoul, or two can they, the thought of actually getting 80 missiles ready with nuclear warheads mated and ready to go, to me is totally inconceivable. I just don't see, the US, would think about that, and certainly more than once or twice. North Korea, I just don't see how that could be at all. And I don't think they have that many nuclear weapons. They certainly have nowhere near those number of weapons actually mated and ready to go. And they don't have those number of missiles. And as you know, enough of their missiles have blown up on launch. And to think of blowing up a missile with a nuclear warhead on it on the launch pad in your own country, again, is a serious limitation. So from a planning standpoint, I just don't see one can come anywhere close to that. And I think those weapons are there for their deterrent purposes in North Korea. What I worry mostly about is through some sort of mistake, misunderstanding, or something else of that nature, one may have the potential of somehow getting 1 or 2 nuclear warheads launched out of North Korea. That's the danger that I look at most closely. So it does turn out, Professor Moon, I've used up more than my 10 minutes, and I'll stop there and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hacker. And those who are watching this webinar, please send your questions and comments by through the chatting function. I have gotten a couple of questions and comments. Please do so. Okay, now we'll turn to Peter Hayes. Dr. Hayes.
Peter, you're muted.
Thank you, Professor Moon. I'm very happy to join Dr. Halperin, Dr. Hecker, and Professor Lim. This is a very important topic to Koreans, to everyone in the Asia-Pacific region, and to the United States in these days of tremendous stress. I just want to very quickly run through some of the war plans that I know about in the course of writing the book Pacific Powder Keg that Professor Moon referred to. The story really begins actually in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, where Koreans were first found themselves caught up in the crossfire of nuclear war because roughly 50,000 Koreans died in those 2 nuclear strikes, and then another roughly 23,000 returned to Korea. We Americans tend to forget that, but I think it's deeply imprinted in the Korean psyche. In a sense, all Koreans are more expert on nuclear war than all our nuclear experts in the United States combined, because they've been underground zero. The next time, of course, that nuclear threat really became salient was during the war, where American nuclear threat was projected against North Korea and China, and where the Soviet nuclear threat first fell over and affected the disposition of American American conventional forces assembling to counterattack, particularly in Pusan, where the Navy was dispersed because of the possible threat of a Soviet nuclear attack. This is perhaps the first time that we see the nuclear shadow cast in both directions in an actual war. In the late 1950s, the United States developed a global war plan to annihilate the Soviet bloc, which included, of course, China and North Korea and Eastern Europe. And as part of that, there were targets, basically all major cities and logistical hubs in North Korea were targeted. And I have to say also tiny Mongolia also had multiple warheads aimed at Ulaanbaatar, which I was surprised to read when that war plan was declassified. As Dr. Halperin said, in the 1970s, the United States shifted from this general approach to a much more limited and regional nuclear warfighting approach, as the war plans were revised away from one gigantic cataclysmic war plan involving nuclear weapons to a whole array of options developed to respond to either a nuclear or a conventional attack on the United States or its allies, including Korea. And at the time in South Korea, there were hundreds, probably more than 1,000 nuclear weapons deployed, tactical and theater nuclear weapons deployed in and around Korea. Over 1,000 US Forces Korea personnel were certified to work with nuclear weapons, which was a huge overhead cost, which distracted much of their capacity away from managing conventional war at the time. And in fact, nuclear weapons were brought into play during the 1976 crisis in August at the demilitarized zone at Panmunjom in the aftermath when the tree cutting team was sent in, which included, of course, South Korea's current president in the backup Korean force to cut down the poplar tree. General Singlaub actually brought nuclear artillery right up to the demilitarized zone and was prepared to use them at that time. Today, the nuclear annex to the US only war plan in Korea is actually primarily run out of Strategic Command in the United States. There's very limited staffing in US Forces Korea itself devoted to the nuclear option. It's almost completely concentrated appropriately on conventional warfare in the peninsula. And that means that the options to use nuclear weapons against North Korea are also highly constrained. Land-based missiles from the United States, as Dr. Halperin pointed out, would be a huge overkill. And politically speaking, they would have to overfly Russia. And I actually find it inconceivable that an American president is going to get on the phone to the Kremlin and say, don't worry about these missiles that look like they might hit Russia. They're going to nuke North Korea. The United States, if it didn't use ICBMs, might use submarine-launched ballistic missiles from submarines in the mid-Pacific. But that has a similar problem to the overflight of Russia, which is that from pretty much all angles of attack, you either have to overfly Japan, or if you're further south to attack North Korea, you would be aiming missiles pretty much directly at Beijing, which has, relative to even Russia, rather poor early warning systems today. So again, you'd have to get on the phone to China, to President Xi, and say, don't worry about the missiles that are heading in your direction, which it's all over Twitter. This is happening at this point. It's really not a risk to you. And these very large nuclear weapons are going to be exploding on the peninsula. I think that that's pretty much inconceivable. Technically, it is possible that you could have what's a depressed trajectory or low angle 15-minute attack from much closer in if you were to deploy American submarines very close to the Korean Peninsula and maybe use one of the recently deployed low-yield nuclear warheads on the missiles on those submarines. I don't think that's very likely, because to do so, you then put those submarines carrying a huge complement of strategic nuclear weapons very close to the anti-submarine warfare capabilities of both China and Russia. I just don't think the United States would take that risk with its ultimate retaliatory force. So what does that leave you to deliver nuclear weapons against North Korea? It really just leaves you with the home-based or continental United States-based or forward deployed, probably in Guam in an emergency, strategic bombers. And these have the advantage from a technical perspective that the warheads that are on the bombs that will be delivered by those bombers are dial-a-bomb. You can actually go from a very low yield, which might be appropriate to a war planner, to a very high yield. and maybe use one or two, maybe a demonstration shot. But if you think about it, to actually fight a war in Korea, which we all know, having been to Seoul many times, and some of us from the northern side of the DMZ, how close it is to Pyongyang as well as Seoul, that a war in Korea is going to be moving in seconds, minutes, hours, and days. And to get in 80 nuclear weapons with strategic bombers from the United States, it's going to be multiple flights with refueling support there and back. I mean, it's sort of like a courier service. It's going to be slow motion nuclear war relative to the speed of war fighting. It's, from a military perspective, almost completely irrelevant. Now, I think that American war planners plan for all kinds of things. That's what the military do, is they plan for wars, so they're not surprised, and that's entirely appropriate. But in reality, politicians and generals almost never fight with the war plan. And the real use of these nuclear weapons is not military. It's about psychology and coercive diplomacy and threat making. And to some extent, the threat making itself becomes the problem that could actually lead someone to go on alert with their conventional forces, and then some mistake happens, there's a loss of control, or maybe someone is probing or pushing too hard, thinking that somehow the risk of nuclear war might stop the other side responding, so I can actually be slightly more adventurous than I otherwise would be with a provocation. And the actual irony is that the nuclear threat of the kind that we saw in 2017 between the United States and North Korea is precisely what may increase the risk of nuclear war, not decrease it. So overall, I'd say that the real issue here is that threat is being used. That's what's actually in play here, not military use in an actual war plan, which will, as Dr. Halpern pointed out correctly, completely and utterly revolve around conventional forces massed at the DMZ, and then whatever each side could bring to bear on such a conflict over days and weeks of fighting in the Korean Peninsula. Luckily, we're nowhere near that at the moment, and the reason for that is very clear. The two sides have actually been talking in recent years, most obviously in the summitry, but even more important than that, and the reason that summitry has actually been possible is because of the inter-Korean military level arms control measures that have ensured that we have not had any real incidents at the demilitarized zone, with the exception of the most recent killing of the South Korean by the North Korean forces, for which Kim Jong-un then apologized. He clearly understood that this transgressed or crossed a line with South Korea that was not acceptable, and he apologized. And it's actually been that inter-Korean conventional military arrangement that created the space for the political discussions that brought down the tension, reduced the risk of nuclear war from where it had climbed because of the threats made by each side, back down to perhaps where it belongs most of the time, which is, according to the markets, roughly 0.1% per year, maybe up to 1% per year when tension is high, risk of war. And then embedded in that is a further risk of the escalation to nuclear war if someone does something really silly and loses control. So I'll stop there for the moment, Professor Moon, and be happy to circle back to more specific issues with our colleagues.
Thank you, Peter. Now I'll turn to Dr. Eun-Jung Lim.
Good. Thank you. Again, thank you very much for having me, Professor Moon and Professor Hacker, Dr. Halperin and Dr. Hayes. Of course, I know all of your names, so I feel very honored to be a panelist of today's seminar. So let me just start with the sentence in the book, the problematic book, about Woodward's Rage. Quote, the Strategic Command in Omaha had carefully reviewed the O-Plan 5027 for regime change in North Korea. And the U.S. response to an attack that could include the use of 80 nuclear weapon. So here the sentence, when I just read it, this 80 refers to a possibility for U.S. again to use. I didn't actually read as the number 80 as a part of North Korea's provocation. Number one reason why I read like that way, as Dr. Hacker already explained, I've never heard from any source, any information source, I've never heard 80, the number 80, specific number 80, about the North Korea's capability. Again, Dr. Hacker, you already explained your own assessment, evaluation, estimation about North Korea's nuclear capability, but latest, for example, publication by SIPRI, Stockholm's SIPRI yearbook, 30, 40, they estimate like at max 40, or a few years ago, DIA, US DIA, they estimate like 60. It was a few years ago from now, so it might have been increasing, but still it's not 80. For me, I mean, to me, it looked like, again, it is about US's nuclear, again, the US's use of nuclear weapon. And having said that, regarding the probability, likeliness of that, of course, all of the other panelists explained your own view. And I definitely agree with Dr. Hayes, Professor Hayes, because military people or U.S. government in general. I spent almost a decade in Washington D.C. But what I learned from my life, my days and years in Washington, one thing, if I just summarize like one thing, I would say U.S., especially White House, they always want to have every toolkit, including nuclear, on the table or in the briefcase or whatever you describe, right? So that's their approach, not only just toward the North Korea, but toward the rest of the world. So that means, again, even though the likeliness, the probability is low, we all know in the reality it's low, and in theory it might not be that high either, but that does not necessarily mean that it's a zero. So having that, how would you say, the reality or the nature of U.S. Or the structure of U.S. decision-making system, because we all know American president has the right to press the button, right? Or you can probably describe it in a different way, nuclear football or biscuit or whatever you call, U.S. president has the right to decide on that. So having had all this kind of, serious reality, whenever we hear this kind of story, South Koreans will panic. I mean, it's definitely, it's not a good news, even though the possibility is low, and it's a very unhappy news, scary news to any South Korean. So how would you say, all this, as Professor Hayes already mentioned, it's all about probably psychological game. But very sadly, all this U.S. is kind of principle. We want to have every toolkit on the table. Again, I understand, and in some way I respect America's that kind of approach too, because it does guarantee the so-called deterrence capability vis-a-vis any antagonistic power. So I understand that. Most of probably South Koreans might understand that too. But whenever we hear this kind of news, this kind of interpretation, or whenever we see so-called strategic capability came in this area, like B-52 or B-2 or F-22 or aircraft carrier or even SLBM or whatever, whenever we see that, the thing is South Koreans will be tired and will not be that happy. Of course, we're not happy. That can result in unnecessary, again, the psychological escalation here in this country as well. For example, again, you know probably several politicians' name who have argued that, you know, we also have to have our own nuclear capability, not just bringing back the U.S.'s strategic or tactical nuclear weapon. We have to have our own capability. Otherwise, it's asymmetric. All this psychological game or security dilemma game never ends. So that kind of, you know, voices might get more popularity having at all these situations. And more important thing is, North Korea has known this. This is nothing new actually. 80 probably is pretty new for me, so I'm going to explain that a little bit later. But North Korea also has known that, you know, Washington is always like that. Again, Washington always has had that option, the nuclear button option. So that cannot actually add any kind of extra encouraging force for Pyongyang to denuclearize. So again, it's pretty much. Even though, you know, Bob Woodward's that sentence is not that accurate because O-Plan 5027 it was replaced to the O-Plan 5015. So as you know, there is an error in this sentence, and we don't know that 80 specifically, does it really refer to the simultaneous attack or like preemptive attack or preventive attack? There is no concrete explanation about it. So we don't know. Again, ambiguity, inaccuracy. So this sentence obviously does have that kind of problem. But again, if I go back to my first point, still the possibility is not zero. That makes South Koreans very frustrated and North Koreans just, you know, spoiled. You know, they have known this. Continuously. Having said that, probably if I add another just extra comments about today's topic, I would say I can't agree more with Professor Hayes or other panelists' observations. Obviously, we have to reduce, even though it's still low, but still we have to reduce further the possibility. So, diplomacy is the only way to solve all this problem, because as other panelists pointed out, unnecessary escalation can happen, especially in this volatile region. China is there and Russia is there. What if they misunderstood whatever those U.S.'s action? So we definitely nobody will want that kind of situations. Definitely diplomacy is the only way. So with the new president, it might be Mr. President, again, the Trump or Mr. Biden, but still I would like to highlight that, again, the only way is, again, the diplomacy. So let me stop here and probably we can discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lim. Okay, what I will do is this: instead of me asking questions, we have several comments and questions from the audience. Therefore, I will start with that one. First question is to Dr. Halperin. That's from the Manpreet Sethi in New Delhi. We have an Indian audience too. Dr. Sethi is also a member of EAF-APLN. She's very renowned, expert on these nuclear issues. Mr. Halperin, does the latest U.S. NPR nuclear posture review not mention the possibility of limited nuclear use to deal with the regional consequences? What is your sense of current American view on the nuclear war fighting? Mike.
Yes, from everything I understand, it does, and I think it's really.
By the way, this is to Dr. Halperin first, okay?
Oh, I'm sorry, it is Halperin. Okay, yeah.
Okay,
well,
sorry, and then I'll get to you. Yeah.
Morton,
Too many H's.
I'll let you handle that one.
The first thing one has to say is there is no single nuclear view in Washington, in the Trump administration, or in any administration. There is always a variety of different views, and there are always war plans. But the military will always tell you the first thing that happens when war begins is you throw away the war plans and figure out what you need to do in the particular situation. The war plans are not reviewed regularly by senior officials. They're certainly not reviewed by civilian officials. And so if there was attention to be given to possibly introducing nuclear weapons, whatever administration it was, would start from the beginning. And the president would ask what the options are, not what the war plan says. And what the options are would have very little to do what was put in the Nuclear Posture Review, which is a compromise document which is designed to protect production capabilities and war plans in nuclear forces, rather than anybody thinking that's actually what I'd want to do if there was a nuclear war. And I think there has always been, as other panelists have said, a belief in the United States that keeping everything on the table as an option, including the use of nuclear weapons, somehow adds to deterrence and deters attacks. My own view is it undercuts deterrence, because if you imply that you need to use nuclear weapons, the fact that you will resist is less credible rather than more credible.
Okay, Dr. Hacker, would you intervene?
Yeah, my response on this particular question, right, is the same. And my own view was, it was unfortunate that it was brought in that way into the NPR, because indeed, I don't think that's the appropriate way for the country to go. It's not the way that we've gone over the years. And so, yes, it's there, but as Morton points out, there are lots of different views. We'll see, what happens next year. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question that I think that question related to, Peter and Mort, since Mort is the author of Bureaucratic Politics and Foreign Policy in 1975 or 4, because I remember while I was studying in the United States, I was using his book as a text. Therefore, a lot of, IR specialists in Korea are very well accustomed to his book. But question is from the Mr. Yoon-Soo Kim, he must be from Seoul, Korea. His question is this, a lot of people talking about rational actor model, but in reality, accidental escalation could be a real problem, such as like a false alarm in Hawaii. Then that could trigger kind of nuclear reaction. And he added one more sentence saying that, like Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Okay, what is your take on that? I think, Peter, you have been dealing with these issues, accidental escalation. Maybe, Peter, you can answer to this question, and then Mort can add some more on this.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor Moon. And in response to Yoon-Soo Kim's question, I wanted to say a couple of words that relates also to the NPR review question. In my studies, what I've discovered is that the main use of nuclear threat in the Korean Peninsula is not deterrence. Deterrence is when you want to, stop someone from doing something that they might do. And if deterrence in this context is stop the North Koreans from attacking South with conventional forces, or today with nuclear force, that hasn't been the actual use of American nuclear threat. And looking at it the other way, the main uses of North Korean threat, The problem is that both sides are not actually making deterrence threats, they're making compellence threats. They're trying to stop what the other side is already doing. From North Korean perspective, strategically, it's forced the United States to change its hostile policy towards them. When I think about the North Koreans' nuclear options, we've got the fact that they're much, much more constrained than the United States. They don't have really a meaningful capacity to attack the United States in the continental United States. They might be able to lob with shorter range missiles a warhead onto Japan or Guam. But the reality is, and I think you can always sort of puncture the balloon very quickly, if you imagine Kim Jong-un being advised by his generals and he's told, well, you can fire a nuclear weapon at Japan, actually used one, the first two words in Korean will be, then what? And if he were to use them in say an attack to stop an aircraft carrier from approaching offshore, well, they can't actually track aircraft carriers with their current surveillance capabilities. So they'd have to use 10 or 12 nuclear weapons to bracket an area around where they think an aircraft carrier might be to disable it. So there's no guarantee of success. But let's say they were to do something like that, attack an aircraft carrier offshore to try and force the United States to back off. Something it's already doing is advancing on them. Next question is, what next? What now? If he fires a shorter range missile at Seoul, next question, Kim Jong-un would ask, what next? That what next question always, to my mind, brings you fundamentally back to reality. What's going on here is that they are playing a game of coercive diplomacy on both sides. This is not about deterrence. This revolves around compellence. It's exploiting the threat for political goals. And for President Trump, it was a perfect political stunt in 2017 to raise the stakes, increase the perceived risk, cause chaos, and then climb down out of the tree by claiming his leadership had avoided nuclear war. So I don't think Mattis in the Woodward book, where he said he was thinking about this, was wrong to think about it. But the real risk actually doesn't arise because of some intention or war plan to strike first. It comes primarily from the increased risk of inadvertent loss of control of conventional forces that leads to war. And both sides increase their readiness, they reduce their negative controls over their own forces, they make mistakes, and so the risk does actually increase, ironically, but not that much. And really this brings us back to the sort of fundamental issue at both sides at the moment, which is nuclear command accountability. With Kim Jong-un, we have a single leader who can make all the decisions in a moment without really consulting anyone. That to me is not a very stable model for nuclear command decision-making. President Trump is currently having a full-on Mussolini Il Duce moment. He actually thinks he's in charge of all this stuff and that he can actually make these decisions on the fly. And I think the question for all of us is, what do we need leaders to demonstrate in terms of a responsible approach to reducing tension, getting away from the nuclear precipice, getting away from relying on the nuclear threat, and kickstarting the diplomatic process that leads us back to peacemaking in the Korean Peninsula, denuclearizing the North Koreans, adopting nuclear risk and conventional war risk reduction measures. And to my mind, one of the most important things that can be done very, very early on is military to military contact and discussions and dialogue between the United States and North Korea, and between American nuclear fuel cycle specialists like Dr. Hecker with their counterparts in North Korea. That's where you get real trust and confidence built between the two sides so that they can both, as President Trump put it, stand down and stand back in another context. And then we can get on with the real business of figuring out how to overcome the what, now 7 decades of standoff in the Korean Peninsula.
Dr. Halperin, rational actor model versus accidental escalation model. What is your comments on it?
I think they're both involved here. The risk is that the United States believes that North Korea is about to launch a conventional attack. It then begins preparations for a conventional attack on North Korea, perhaps to preempt the North Korean conventional attack. And then the North Koreans decide the only way to stop that is by firing a nuclear weapon. Jeffrey Lewis has written a novel which, if you like to worry about these issues, is worth reading, not because anybody, including he, would say it is the way it would actually happen, but it gives you a sense of how things might get out of control. The danger is that you have actors with particular goals, which you might call rational actors, but then you have systems which get out of control and which you can be used in a way that nobody intended. So I subscribe very much to what Peter has said. We have to move away from hostility and confrontation. We have to recognize that there never was an option of military force to eliminate the North Korean regime, and it never was going to collapse, although people kept hoping it would. We have to learn to live with the North Korean regime, to hope it will evolve slowly over time, but in the meantime make it clear to them that there is not a threat of American military force, that everybody understands that that's not a reasonable option. There is, of course, no reasonable use of North Korean military force, whether nuclear or conventional, and therefore we have to learn to live with each other. We have to do things that reduce the risk of accidents and miscalculation, and we have to start moving finally towards negotiations of a peace regime rather than a nuclear confrontation.
Now, I have one question. I think it must be from China. Chen asked this following question. I think that both Professor Lim and Dr. Hecker can answer to this question. Question is that North Korea only says denuclearization, not abandoning or dismantling nuclear weapons. Will North Korea abandon its nuclear weapons? Under what condition will North Korea abandon its nuclear weapons? Maybe Professor Lim, you can answer first, and then Dr. Hecker answer too.
Yes, whenever we try to analyze, what can be really the cause when we are trying to deal with North Korea, whenever we try to answer that question, we definitely go back to their intention. It is still kind of vague. Of course, we know, obviously they need survival, regime survival. That's the top #1 priority. That's pretty much obvious. So from their own regime's interest point of view, they want to use this nuclear capability as a more kind of shield rather than a sword, probably. So that's okay. That's we get it. We get the point. But under what condition, as this Chinese guest, as he asked, under what condition North Korean Kim family and his own people can see the guarantee from us. To be very honest, I personally cannot think, inter-Korea cooperation, economic cooperation, or any political social cooperation solely that cannot guarantee that. Which is very sad, which is very unfortunate to any South Korean people. But that's the reality. As long as they developed nuclear for their own regime survival, again, as long as they are trying to just undermine or at least shake the existing nuclear governance structure, global governance structure, So again, the South Korea only solely cannot guarantee that. So that is why, again, the U.S.'s guarantee is necessary conditions, not just, you know, of course, it might not be really the sufficient condition, but it's at least it's a necessary condition. And once they got, you know, that kind of so-called guarantee, regime security guarantee, they probably want to sell it as expensive as possible. So that might include the sanction issues or inter-Korean cooperation issues and so on. But again, what I'm trying to say is the first priority is definitely their own, you know, from their point of view, their own survival, and that cannot be guaranteed by the South Korea only. So that obviously the United States needs to work on it. What can be really the opening for the further development in terms of denuclearization. Again, as you already know, President Moon Jae-in delivered that speech at the United Nations, and he mentioned about the possibility of formally ending the Korean War. I think that should be considered. They can be considered, I think. It's probably, it can be a one opening option. And more important thing, I want to emphasize as the last point is definitely North Korea also have to declare what they have. Even though it might not be really complete, we probably need to be more cautious about that kind of possibility too, but still the declaration of what they have is another like necessary condition to move on. So all the things, how to order all this process is really art of, I think, diplomacy of South Korea and the United States. Thank you.
Dr. Hecker?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Moon and Professor Lim. So the question, I guess, can be put the following way, that I've been asked that question many times. Will Kim Jong-un give up his nuclear weapons? And my answer to that is, I don't know. And then I would add, and neither does Kim Jong-un. He doesn't know either, because it depends. It depends on so many of the things that have already been said. You know, right now the conditions are such that the nuclear weapons do something for him, which is really crucial. It's regime survival. And one needs to get over that. One needs to get over the issue, as Peter had mentioned before, the issue of hostile policy, which is what the North Koreans, you know, have told everyone. They've told me that many, many times. And so what has to be done, though, there, in my opinion, there is no single piece of paper. There is no single guarantee that can be given to Kim Jong-un and to the rest, you know, of his leadership team that will make him give up those nuclear weapons. It has to be a process. It's a step-by-step process that will build on each other to develop the confidence and the trust that at some point that he will figure out those nuclear weapons are not the treasured sword, but they're a burden. They're a burden that his country can't afford anymore. And that's a process. You know, I've laid out an overall game plan, a framework in color charts and everything else in 2018. It's, you know, it's going to take at least 10 years. And you have to walk through that process in a way that will finally convince them that it's better for them to give up the nuclear weapons. And Professor Lim, I do disagree with one of the things that you said. What you said is very reasonable, and almost everyone has said it, and that is they have to declare up front. You know, in other words, if they're actually going to denuclearize, they have to tell you what they've got, and then they get rid of it, and you watch and you monitor. It's not gonna happen. It hasn't happened so far. It's not gonna happen anytime in the near future. And in 2007, 2008, when the Bush administration was actually making some progress on diplomacy after its disastrous start in 2001, 2, 3, and 4, it was right in July and August of 2008 that essentially the Bush administration, unfortunately, again, killed the dialogue, and they killed it by the fact that they came up with a declaration and verification plan that was impossible for the North Koreans to accept. So Chris Hill was making progress. Things looked, pretty promising. And then the State Department specifically put together the request for declaration, and that turned everything bad. And then, of course, as you well know, later in August of 2008, Kim Jong-il had a stroke. And the combination of those two things, in my opinion, killed the rest of the Bush administration chance to do anything. So we don't want to make the same mistake again to say you have to declare up front. The declaration has to come sort of piece by piece. The way that I would see it is, okay, let's do the plutonium. Okay, let's go ahead and declare the plutonium, reasonably straightforward. We know where they make the plutonium. They're not making any now. And let's just a combination of declaration, verification, let's shut down the plutonium operations permanently. That's a good start. Then eventually we'll have to worry about the highly enriched uranium, worry about the missiles, worry about the other things. So I can see this doing in a step-by-step process that actually would have a chance to eventually get him to the point where Kim Jong-un decides he's better off without the weapons.
But Kim Jong-un proposed that in Hanoi last year. He proposed to dismantle highly enriched uranium facilities and plutonium production facilities in Yongbyon, but President Trump just rejected it.
Okay, so now actually, Professor Moon, now that you've mentioned that, it is one of my big concerns and pet peeves, as you will know, because we've discussed it before. I thought Hanoi was a disaster from an American standpoint. We made a major, major mistake by walking away from Hanoi. And actually, what I didn't appreciate until the Woodward book, which is actually much more important to me than this 80 nuclear weapon comment, is the Woodward book has like 26 of the letters, exchanges, between Kim and President Trump. They're really fascinating. But there's one in there that's incredible. I never knew this happened, where Kim Jong-un actually not only says he's willing to get rid of Yongbyon, the production capability for fissile materials, but he actually says the Nuclear Weapons Institute. He actually specifically mentions in the letter the Nuclear Weapons Institute. We don't know exactly what it is, but by mirror imaging, that's like Los Alamos. Well, if you give up Los Alamos in the United States of America, of course, you'd have to do Livermore along with it because we've got two of them. You've given up the nuclear weapons program. You still have bombs out there, but the bombs are no good without the scientists that designed them know how to take them back. And that offer was actually made by Kim, and it was in September, just before, September 2018, just before the Moon and Kim summit up in South Korea. That was an incredible offer. You combine that with Hanoi, and all I can say is we missed a golden opportunity.
By the way, okay, now let me ask it, we have just 10 to 15 minutes left, but I will ask some of the important questions. Then you all agree that Bob Woodward's mentioning of 80 nuclear weapons is kind of misquote or ill-informed quote. Do you all agree? Peter, you agree?
Pretty much. It was ambiguous. It was not contextualized properly. And for those who don't know the detail of the peninsula, it was easily taken out of context and misinterpreted.
Okay, Maud.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay.
Well, I would say it was just misunderstood. It was totally misunderstood. Just to give you the indication, I read that. I didn't even blink an eye. Okay, it didn't bother me at all because it was clear they didn't know what they were talking about. We've got Woodward, who doesn't really know nuclear weapons, talking to Trump, who doesn't really know nuclear weapons.
Okay, Professor Lim.
Well, I think I already shared my observation as inaccurate. The O-Plan 5027, that's the older one. And again, the idea is not clarifying what kind of, again, the nuclear. And as long as there is an ambiguity and inaccuracy, again, it's not that.
You are all nuclear expert now, then we can conclude that the mentioning of the use of 80 nuclear weapons is misleading. Okay, second question. If you look at Bob Woodward's, sorry, yes.
I just want to say something about Mattis. Mattis wasn't wrong to think about this worst case scenario, the absolute worst case, because President Trump was creating a real fear in North Korea and a real risk that did increase at the time. That doesn't mean that there was any intention by any political or military leader in the United States to actually implement such a plan. But given what Kim Jong-un was saying and what President Trump was saying, it was absolutely correct for Mattis to be thinking about it and thinking about what he would do if he got an order to implement such a strike.
Okay, that point is very clear. That point was clarified in the Bob Woodward interview with NPR. Mm-hmm. In his interview with NPR in a public radio broadcast, what Bob Woodward said was, what Mattis said was this: if North Korea undertake preemptive nuclear strike, I was, given authority to intercept that incoming missile. Then Kim Jong-un would use 24, couple of dozen nuclear weapons. Then that will kill the millions. And then Kim Jong-un does not have any right to kill those millions of people. That is kinds of wording. Do you think that kind of sequence is possible? And do you think US...
Yes, there are escalation pathways or scenarios in which people do lose control and do make bad decisions, including decisions involving weapons of mass destruction. And that's happened a number of times in history. It's not an American thing. It's a human thing that happens when you have big organizations and weapons of mass destruction. That's why we need global and regional nuclear arms control and disarmament agreements. But just imagine if you imagine it the other way around. Imagine that President Trump had said such things and General Mattis didn't think about it, just took it as a given that he would automatically act on such an order rather than examining it for its strategic logic and whether it would be legal under international law, whether it was militarily necessary and proportionate. Because remember, his duty is to humanity under international law and to the Constitution under American law when he gets a nuclear strike order. And it is actually his legal and moral obligation to say, no, I will not implement such a strike if it is not militarily necessary and there are alternative ways of achieving your goals, Mr. President. So I'm very glad that General Mattis was thinking about this.
In the statement of James Mattis, there was an assumption that North Korea would undertake preemptive nuclear strike against the United States. Now, Sig, do you buy that assumption?
I just they don't have the capacity to do that.
Or Mort?
They don't have the capacity to do it, nor any reason to do it. The only time I think there would be a risk of it is if they thought that there was a large conventional attack about to come to them, and they thought if we fire one nuclear weapon, maybe somehow we'll stop it. It would be irrational and crazy, but that's the only scenario in which I can conceive of the North giving any serious consideration to firing a nuclear weapon.
Let us go back to May 1994. William Perry was thinking about surgical strike in Yongbyon. Did that plan include the use of nuclear weapons such as a bunker burst? Maybe at the time there was no bunker burst. But if that situation happens now, if United States going to make a preemptive strike on the nuclear facility in North Korea. Isn't there any chance the U.S. would use a bunker burst, the tactical nuclear weapon?
Sorry, Chung-In, the military planning that was being presented to then Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, prepared in the White House by staff and then was briefed to President Clinton, was to use a cruise missile to shut down the spent fuel pond without causing a fire and creating a radiological cloud that might have put another country, including South Korea, but not just South Korea, at risk. And then President Carter's trip intervened. There was no thinking of using a nuclear weapon in that contingency. But I've also heard Secretary Perry state that he knew at the time it was impossible to even implement such a minimal or such a limited strike using a conventional cruise missile, because they would have had to prepare in Seoul in advance. That would have leaked. There would have been student and other protests, and such a strike would have been politically impossible. So yes, preparations were being made, war planning was being thought through to make these threats credible as part of the strategy of forcing the North Koreans to back off their escalation at the time, pulling the fuel rods out, etc. But then President Carter's trip intervened, and guess what? Diplomacy ruled the day.
Dr. Hecker, is there any chance that North Korea would test launch another ICBM before or immediate after November presidential election?
No. Oh, you mean just to test one?
Yeah, test.
Oh, to test an ICBM. That I could not rule out. That's possible, but I don't. My own gut reaction is no. I do not think so. I think so far they've shown that the ICBM test and the nuclear test is still such that they want to stay away from those. They still need to do those. And so in the next administration, I wouldn't rule that out. And it would not be because it's a provocation. It would be because, as I've watched them, for the last 20 years, each of those tests or things that they've run have been in the direction of improving their overall capabilities. That's why they would do a next test. But for each of those tests has a price. And I think at this point, they're not willing to pay that price.
Professor Lim, what is your take on that one? Is there any chance that North Korea would undertake?
Well, I agree with Dr. Hecker's that observation. Of course, in terms of possibility, it's not zero either, but there might not be that good incentive, good motivations for them to do so immediately.
Dr. Halperin.
I think there's some risk, and I think that my advice to the next administration would be to seek an agreement explicitly from the North Koreans that they will not do any further nuclear weapons tests and missile tests, and draw from them what they would want in return. For example, some suspension of certain specified military exercises, or maybe a declaration. They go back and forth, and people go back and forth in guessing. But I would say to the North Koreans, it is very important to the future of a peaceful settlement that there be no further nuclear or missile tests. And we would like an agreement with you that you will do that, and want to know from you what it is you would like in return. And we should focus on negotiating that limited agreement in a form that has no ambiguity in it. Both sides understand exactly what each other has agreed to do. And I think then we can build on that slowly, step by step, towards a comprehensive agreement.
Peter?
Well, I think if President Trump survives the election and the virus, both of those, and he's still in the White House, then all bets are off, because I don't think that summitry is going to go anywhere. I don't think the North Koreans at this point really believe that President Trump can deliver any real change in the structure of threat that they find themselves trapped in. And then we're back to the roller coaster ride of nuclear and missile testing and everything that goes with it. It is still conceivable, if Trump is elected, that There could be some symmetry which could delay some of these kinds of North Korean long-term research and development of these weapon systems and deployment, but actually coming back into denuclearization discussions and agreements to get rid of the long-range and intermediate-range missiles would not really be possible under those circumstances. If Biden is elected, I think it's at least possible, although low probability, that they would shift outside of simply reverting to strategic patience and primary reliance on political and military containment, political isolation, economic sanctions, and military containment of North Korea to a much expanded set of comprehensive regional security steps of the kind that Dr. Halpern has outlined in the past, the creation potentially of a nuclear weapon-free zone, all kinds of confidence-building measures, which, for example, could include a joint space launch rocket with South Korea, which is now pursuing solid propellant fuel for its own missiles. So it's really time, I think, to think about that kind of joint project, not just joint power systems and so forth, in a denuclearization strategy with various cooperative measures and economic incentives. And then finally, I'd say it's time to, irrespective of the nuclear threat, to really see if we can bring North Korea back into the international community, even if it's nuclear armed, because we have some truly urgent global existential threats that we are all dealing with at the moment. Most importantly, the pandemic and public health and climate change. And these are two areas where we need North Korea to actually play a role for global, not just Korean reasons. And so engaging them thoroughly on those fronts as well may be, ironically, the backdoor into achieving the kind of cooperative and comprehensive solution to the North Korean and American and Russian and Chinese nuclear threat that is actually brought to bear on the Korean Peninsula.
It was a wonderful discussion, very informative, insightful, and comprehensive. And I think we should organize this kind of webinar more open. But by way of concluding this session, let me make a couple of remarks. Recently I read Fred Kaplan's The Bomb. It was a very, very illuminating book. And his conclusion is very simple. Okay, since Truman used the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, during the Korean War, he thought about using nuclear weapon, but he didn't do that. Eisenhower didn't do that. After Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy deliberated in that option. He didn't do that. Johnson, Nixon, Madman theory, okay, Reagan, all deliberated in the potential use of nuclear weapons, but they never used it. Why? I think that is the power of American rationality and moral responsibility. I hope the United States would continue that tradition of honoring, okay, reasoning and moral responsibility. And as Peter and Sig pointed out, North Korea knows if they use first preemptive strike, and that will be end of North Korea. Not only North Korea, end of South Korea too. Therefore, I think that creates enormous deterrence against North Korea. I still believe in nuclear deterrence. Of course, my firm conviction is to get rid of nuclear weapons. That is the best way. Living in the nuclear weapons-free world is kind of the goal which human race should strive towards, But anyhow, in this sense that I'm somewhat relieved after today's discussion, U.S. is, even though there's a chance of accidental escalation, there is a good chance for restraint on the part of the U.S., and there's a good chance for the restraint of North Korea. With that good news out of this bad environment. In fact, Yong-Soo Hwang, another APLN member, sent a comment saying that there should be, big difference between worst case scenario and the best scenario. And we should strive toward finding the best scenario, not worst scenario. And also Manfred said to send, concluding word, thanks everyone for an excellent session. I again thank you very much for joining this session. And let us have another round of webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Colleagues, it was great to see you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Okay, all done. 자, close session 하지.